Welcome to the Newslaundry interview. A Free Man is journalist Aman Sethi's first book, published in 2011. Aman was recently the Chhattisgarh correspondent for The Hindu, still with The Hindu. Hi Aman, I'm going to just launch into this interview with a few lines from the book. You said in the book, I'm trying to write a book, but who will want to read it? I don't know, I suppose my friends and a few people who are interested in Delhi. Well, it's been a year since the book came out, and you've had time to judge the response. Are you surprised by it?
Am I surprised by it? Well, I guess on the one hand I am sort of surprised by it, but on the other hand, the English reading community is quite small. So I guess it's done okay. It's done fine.
Just want to hear a simple description of A Free Man from you before we analyze its appeal.
Well, to put it simply, A Free Man is, I guess it's a biography of Muhammad Ashraf, a man who lives on Delhi's pavements. And I spent about 5 years tracking him. And so it's a book about him. And in some ways, it tries to tell a larger story about urban life through his life.
What's the appeal? I mean, what do you think is the appeal of the book?
I think the appeal lies in the fact that the book sort of explores a terrain which isn't really explored much in Indian media anymore. I think the book also explores this terrain through a trope which is not the standard journalistic format of sorrow. And I think what that does is it allows the reader to just read about a life rather than feel like the reader is committing an act of virtue by reading about someone who comes from a different class from the reader.
Bingo, because the main character, Ashraf, is a dihadi laborer, a daily wage earner, a safedi wala. And yet when I stepped into his life through your book, it seemed familiar because you're not really passing judgment and the sorrow theme is not overwhelming. Did it take a fair bit of effort from you to make sure that you weren't passing judgment?
Well, I think the book sort of came out of a project, a 6-month project at the CSTS Sarai, where the idea behind the project was to search for a form of writing which went beyond problems and solutions and this idea of journalistic judgment. Suspension of judgment was the first sort of practice of the fellowship and the writing that came out of the fellowship. So by the time I started working on the book, I was fairly clear about the terrain that I was working on and the mode that I would use. But I suppose as young journalists, you feel like your work should directly result in some kind of policy intervention. If you can suspend your sense of importance about yourself, then you realize that perhaps it's best that people don't really listen to your recommendations, but just observe the material you uncover. So that's what the book really does. It's not something that presumes to find problems and prescribe solutions. It's a book that just hopes to understand.
And it does that effectively. But to write that book, you also had to gain the acceptance of Ashraf and the group of people that you've described in the book. And was that a little harder than you had anticipated at the start? Because you said this was 5 years of work, and when one reads the book, you're there, maybe not every day, but almost. And that acceptance from them, was that tougher than you had anticipated?
No, actually, I think it was easier than I thought. I didn't really know what to expect when I went there. I was aware that there might be some resistance, but there was hardly any resistance. Everyone is always curious to know what someone is doing in a space when you clearly aren't from that space. And once you talk about your project and you talk to people about your project, then the people who want to get behind it, and the people who don't. And there was in no way this sense of thrusting a camera or microphone in anyone's face. It was a fairly participative sort of process. It wasn't really even a process. I would just show up and spend time and record.
So what, did you go there every day? Did you just hang out for 8-10 hours a day? I couldn't put my finger on that.
Well, for the first 6 months, I went there very often. I went there about twice a week. And then gradually, as time went by and my life took me in different directions, their lives took them in different directions. I'd scaled it back, but there was no real pattern of I will go there Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And over a period of time, I just kept recording. A lot of the stuff is done in the mornings before they went to work. And
they were at their lucid best at that time.
They were at their lucid best. There's a lot of stuff in the evening as well, when they were winding down from work. And then in the middle, I realized that I had this whole period where I didn't really have any sense of their work. So then there was a period where I was deliberately going early and then staying and going to work sites with them just to see what it was like.
You know, you're a journalist, and journalists tend to be obsessed with facts, and then you write this book, which is non-fiction, and just from the focus you've expressed in trying to get Ashraf's timeline, you know, his life timeline, it seems like it would be pretty tough to get the facts and be comfortable that you've got them all. Was that true?
Yeah, initially there was this sense of an obsession with fact. And then over a period of time, I started reading on oral history. And I think oral history was an interesting sort of subject to read about. It gave you an interesting trope again to imagine an event not as it occurs, but an event as it is perceived. And as we know from reporting on the field, that there is a distinction between that.
True.
But you also realize that people tend to live their lives based on how the events are perceived rather than the events actually occurred. And that doesn't mean that you give up the pursuit of actual occurrence, but that doesn't mean that the idea of a perception or a personal narrative related to these events is irrelevant. So, for instance, there's this interesting period where Ashraf remembers one particular day and one particular incident because he went somewhere in the morning to meet a particular character, and she tells him to go home because Indra is dead. And that's always interesting, where suddenly, you know, somewhere in Bihar, this news event occurs. And given when Indra died, we don't know if it was actually the day that Indra died or whether it took, 20 hours. I mean, obviously the state administration would have known very soon. But for the news to percolate down in a time when there wasn't instant television, where I actually haven't gone back and checked, but I know that once upon a time government broadcasters would allow for a certain period of time to pass before news was put out, so that they could contain the fallout of this kind of news. So I don't know.
And yet you got to fix.
You got to fix.
You know, because he recalls that so clearly in his book. So I understand oral history and, putting the timeline down through that. But the journalistic process versus that of being an author, are the two quite different? Or, does one set of skills help the other process? I mean,
well, I mean, we could.
Or am I trying to distinguish too much? I mean, there's no difference.
No, I don't know. I mean, we could. If you want, we could. If you want to really talk about the writing process itself, then of course there is a difference. And I guess one of the reasons where this comes out from is if you just look at the form, because you're as a newspaper or as a magazine writer, you end up the scope of your imagination is bounded by the space that you have.
Right.
So the scope of your story is bounded by the space that you have. And with a book, it's like, it can be as long as you want, and it can be as detailed as you want. And it's sort of hard to calibrate yourself to this much larger field. So it takes time. And it's also a question of varying narrative pace, because you're now thinking in terms of chapters rather than, just, lead, nut graph, deck, conclusion. So it's a different kind of thing, but if you have a good editor like I was lucky to have, then it's not it's okay.
Coming back to the book, we all tend to obsess about Ashraf, but there's so many other wonderful characters in the book, Lalu, Rehan. You've got, Sharmaji. I was kind of fascinated by Sharmaji, but then you also have Kalyani. And while reading A Free Man, I got very detailed descriptions of professions. I use those words loosely. We all use those words loosely. A head kasai and a safedi wala and a mazdoor and a beldar, but we don't really know exactly what they do. And you've spent a fair bit of time describing exactly what goes into that job. It's educative. Was that your objective?
It's not educative. I think it's informative because there's no pedagogic thrust. But I think that there is I'm just really obsessed with how people pass their day. Like, I have friends who are bankers, and I say, you wear a suit and go to work. And what do you do? You know, like
What do you do
minute
all
by
day?
minute, hour by hour, like what are you doing? Are you primarily answering phone calls? Are you primarily looking at data streams? What are you doing really? And there was this really influential book that I read. I was really fortunate while I was doing all of this to be surrounded by this team of, my sister, my friends, who were all sort of extremely well read and extremely sort of bright and very, have really eclectic taste. So I was constantly being fed this kind of diet of absolutely fascinating stuff. So I ended up reading this sort of path-breaking book called Working by Studs Terkel, who is also in some ways has done a lot of work on oral history, where the whole book is just a series of interviews with people, asking them what they do and what they think when they do it. So, waitresses, factory workers, prostitutes, the guy who polishes shoes in a hotel bathroom in America back in, whenever this book was written, I think 60s, 70s, I'm not sure. So
That book's influence shows up in your book.
yeah, because you realize that craft is a extremely personal thing.
So a head Kasai's proficiency basically
Yeah.
is measured by the fact he can make a 1 kilo chicken, 1.5 kilos
Well,
by
not
the
just
end.
that,
I mean,
right?
that was a fascinating little nugget.
Yeah, but just this idea of how to cut, I mean, you're a guy who is, not been through sort of, a structural or civil engineering program, and you're building houses. Now, how is that knowledge transmitted from one person to another? As a journalist, we tend to assume that without the media, people never knew anything, and people didn't know. There was no mode of sharing ideas outside of media, which is not true. And so it's really important, or it was very interesting for me to find out how, like often I'd be like, okay, so you know X bit of trivia, like how did you get to know this? Who told you? And you realize that stuff sort of percolates.
A free man basically, and I'm talking just for myself here, it sensitized me without sermonizing. And when I say sensitized, I mean it in sort of the least weighty way you can think of that word. Just opened up my eyes to a city. I've lived in the city for 20 years. We all have laborers in and out of our lives in our homes, and don't pay much attention to them. So bottom line, it's sensitized without sermonizing, and in a sense, was that what you were trying to achieve, or?
No,
nothing.
Sure, you have an objective, right? Your objective is to write this book. Your objective is to make this book as porous as possible. Your objective is to let the material breathe as much as possible. But I mean, to think that this book will now mean that everyone will now look at labor more sensitively. I mean, that's great if you want to do that, but that's not my interest.
Have you heard from Ashraf?
Well, have I heard from Ashraf? So I was in touch with Ashraf for a significant period of time, and since you ask, Ashraf died of tuberculosis recently. So I was there in Calcutta some time ago, and I met some of his last few friends and sort of went to the graveyard, and yeah, so he died of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis.
The sorrow in the book is in the final destination for many of these people, which is, it seems to always be a hospital, and tuberculosis stares many of them in the face. And, to that extent, you have dealt with the sorrow in their lives. So, like everything else that you sort of explored and discovered while writing this book, you've actually been to the hospitals in North Delhi, to the hospitals in Calcutta, and it seems, I'm not sure I can find the right word for it, but is the system sort of gearing up and meeting their needs?
I think that given the kind of funding that public health has in India, and given the kind of priority that it has, I think the hospitals are doing the best they can. I think the doctors who are at these hospitals are committed people who genuinely care about the patients that they deal with. But I think the doctors and the nurses and everyone who is part of that edifice is of course dealing with a paucity of resources, and dealing with the fact that at one level this is not something that is of great interest to policy. and that there seems to be a sort of focus on sort of this idea of, you know, private healthcare and super specialty hospitals, and there's a whole sort of kind of edifice that seems to be gearing itself towards providing healthcare for a very different kind of people. And public health, like, you know, public education, is something that, since the elites, I think, have seceded from, is something that is not, doesn't seem to be a massive priority. And I mean, there is talk of now setting up these 6 AIMS-like organizations, right? But when public health delivers, it works really well. But like I said, for that, you need a sort of, you need to care about this kind of stuff. And I mean, yeah.
Palpable shortage of resources is what I felt in your descriptions as well.
There is, and you know, I mean, the guys who are there are sort of doing this kind of heroic work, right? But I guess the thing is, we shouldn't really bank on heroism as a matter of public policy. I mean, it's crazy for doctors to work the way they do, and but at the same time, we also know that a whole bunch of doctors choose not to work in public health, and, you know, work in universities that are subsidized, and then go on to work in super specialty hospitals. So, and then, you know, you have hospitals who get, you know, land from the government at extremely subsidized rates, and then don't set aside seats for, you know, or beds rather for treatment. I mean, there have been, you know,
innumerable cases of that.
It's crazy that you have to go to the court to get people to do what they promised to do in their contracts.
I'm quoting one of Ashraf's lines here: the ideal job is the perfect balance of kamai and azaadi. And for Aman Sethi, is the kamai coming from journalism and the azaadi coming from writing the book? Or, you know, like, how does it work? How does that, have you found that kamai azaadi balance yet, or too young for that?
Well, I think that no, I think that, I mean, it's a dynamic equilibrium, right? As Ashraf points out. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing right now. So I'm not really concerned too much about. I think azaadi is what is of particular importance at this period, and, you know, the money will come at some point.
So is there anything new in the works? In terms of a book?
In terms of a book, no. I'm just sort of looking around for ideas. The book is going to be released in the US later this year and in the UK. So there's a lot of work. I mean, it's still not fully out of my system. So I think in what are we in, 2012? So I guess 2013 I'll start thinking. And then let's see. I mean, it's a long process, these things, as I've realized.
So you write the book and then you hit the circuit. And what has that part of it been like? Because clearly you just acknowledged that, you know, the circuit is still very much alive.
So at Jaipur, there was this great...
I know, I heard you quote that. That's where I picked it from.
Yeah. You write the book, you hit the circuit. Well, there hasn't been that much of...
What is the circuit? I mean, what's the circuit to the extent that you've experienced it as an author?
The circuit as I've experienced it is a short circuit. It is, you write the book, and then, you know, you find yourself at interviews like these parsing meaning and mining your work for meaning, which did not exist at the time that you wrote it. And it's, I guess you just end up, I guess at some point, I haven't thought about this book as deeply as I have after, while I was writing it. So it's just it's a series of these kinds of events where you're just trying to get people interested in reading. And I guess we're up against a lot of very different media. And to try and write a work that expects people to set aside, you know, time in their day is, I guess you realize how hard it is. You realize that, you know, even after you work for a newspaper, and, you know, if you get page 1, then you've got 1 million people reading you literally the next morning. But with a book, there's a whole different
It's a bigger
world.
challenge. Where is Aman Sethi, the journalist, headed next? In East Africa?
No, I don't know right now, actually. We're just waiting to see where we go next. I've spent 2 years in Chhattisgarh. I've been back. I've been writing about labor now, again, after a long time.
And most recently, Maruti.
About Maruti and unions. And I've been sort of out of this world for the last 2 years. So it's good to be back and sort of thinking about, again, work. And again, I think one piece that I did last year when the Maruti crisis happened for the first time was just a piece on, you know, the task performed by various people on an assembly line, and, you know, the time you have and how you do it. And that was really interesting, you know, just to figure that, okay, you go to the factory, but what do you do
at the factory?
And that's what I'm really obsessed with, like, what do people do? So it's such a fundamental question.
And maybe you'll write many more books when you're trying to, while you're trying to answer that fundamental question. Aman Sethi,
Thank you.
Great to have you on the Newslaundry
Thank you.
interview.
Thank you for having me.